Imagine being judged before you even speak a word. The afternoon sun hung high over downtown Arlington, heat rising off the pavement in soft waves as people moved quickly along the sidewalks, heads down, chasing schedules, coffee cups in hand, conversations blending into a constant hum of city life. And right in the middle of it all stood Ava Carter, still, composed, almost out of place in her quiet presence, dressed simply in a navy blazer and slacks, nothing flashy. Nothing that demanded attention, yet somehow she drew it anyway, the kind of attention that didn't ask questions first but assumed answers, the kind that weighed her skin before her voice. And just as she reached for her phone, a sharp voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Ma'am, step aside." Officer Daniel Hayes approached with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid, his eyes already locked with suspicion that hadn't been earned. People slowed, just enough to watch without getting involved, because that's what crowds do. They witness, they whisper, but they rarely step in. Ava turned her head slightly, calm, measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice steady, almost gentle, but it didn't matter, not to him, because in his mind the situation had already been decided. "I need you to move along," he said, his tone firm, final, like a command disguised as a request. And when she didn't immediately comply, when she simply stood there, breathing evenly, looking at him not with fear but with something else, something quieter, something stronger, the tension shifted, subtle but undeniable. "You're causing a disturbance," he added, though nothing about her movement or presence had disrupted anything except his expectation of control. A few phones lifted higher now, capturing the moment, capturing the imbalance, capturing the story before it even knew what it was becoming. Ava glanced briefly at the reflection in a nearby storefront window, not at herself, but at the scene behind her. The forming crowd, the officer's stance, the way the air itself seemed to tighten, and still she didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't react the way he expected, because she didn't need to, because somewhere deep beneath the surface of this moment, something far bigger was already in motion, but no one around them could see it yet, not the man adjusting his sunglasses 2 feet away, not the woman whispering into her phone, not even Officer Hayes, whose confidence only grew stronger with every second of silence he mistook for submission. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he said, stepping closer now, closing the distance as if proximity equaled authority. And for the first time, Ava's eyes met his fully, not defiant, not afraid, just steady, unshaken, like someone who had already seen how this would end, like someone waiting for the exact right moment to let the truth speak for itself. And as the city noise faded just enough for the tension to breathe, one quiet thought lingered in the air, unnoticed, unspoken, but undeniable. He thought he was in control. But he had no idea who he had just stopped. The request for identification lingered in the air, heavier than it should have been, as if it carried more than just procedure, as if it carried assumption, and Ava did not move right away, not because she refused, but because she understood something that no one else there seemed to grasp, that this moment was no longer about a simple question, it had already become something else entirely. Something shaped by perception rather than fact. Officer Hayes shifted his weight, impatience creeping into his posture, his fingers brushing lightly against his belt as he glanced at the growing circle of onlookers, people pretending not to stare while capturing every second, because moments like this traveled fast, faster than truth, faster than context. "I asked for your identification," he repeated, sharper now, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the crowd, and still Ava remained composed, her breathing steady, her expression unreadable. She reached slowly into her bag, not hurried, not nervous, each movement deliberate, controlled, as if she were setting the pace of the moment rather than reacting to it. A few steps away, a man in a gray suit paused mid-stride, his attention fixed not on the officer, but on Ava. His hand hovering near his earpiece though he had not yet touched it, as if waiting for something, or someone, to confirm what he already suspected. The air felt different now, thicker, quieter, even the city sounds seemed to pull back, giving space to what was unfolding. Ava withdrew a small wallet, holding it loosely in her hand, but she did not open it immediately. Instead she looked directly at Hayes again, her voice calm. Almost too calm for the situation. "Before I do that, officer, may I Ask what exactly I am being stopped for. It was a simple question, reasonable, expected, but it landed in a way that shifted the balance ever so slightly. Because questions like that required answers, and answers required clarity, something Hayes did not seem prepared to provide. You are being detained for suspicious behavior, he replied quickly, too quickly, the words sounding rehearsed, detached from anything real, a phrase used more out of habit than evidence. A murmur rippled through the crowd, subtle but present, people exchanging glances, not of outrage, not yet, but of uncertainty. Because something about that answer did not sit right, not with the way Ava stood, not with the way she carried herself, not with the silence that surrounded her like a shield rather than a weakness. And still she did not argue, did not raise her voice, she simply nodded once, as if acknowledging not the accusation, but the moment itself, as if marking the point where everything would begin to turn. The man in the gray suit finally touched his earpiece, his voice low, almost a whisper. Confirm visual, he said, eyes never leaving Ava, and somewhere beyond the edges of the scene, beyond the awareness of the crowd, something responded, something moved. But here, on this sunlit street, Officer Hayes took a small step forward, extending his hand expectantly, waiting, believing that control was still his, believing that this was just another routine stop, just another face in a crowd. Just another moment that would pass without consequence. And Ava, still holding the wallet, tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering, her voice quiet but certain. Are you sure you want to continue this? And for the briefest second, barely noticeable, something flickered across Hayes's expression, not fear, not doubt, but something closer to hesitation, the kind that appears when certainty begins to crack. But it was gone just as quickly as it came, replaced again by authority, by habit, by the need to be right, because he could not yet see what was already unfolding. He could not yet hear the distant shift in the system he trusted, he could not yet understand that this moment was no longer his to control. The question did not raise her voice, but it shifted the air in a way no command could, and for a moment the street seemed to hold its breath, as if even the noise of passing cars understood that something invisible had just changed. Officer Hayes straightened slightly, his jaw tightening as he processed her words, not because they were loud, but because they were certain, and certainty, when it did not come from him, felt like resistance. I am sure, he replied, though the confidence in his tone was thinner now, stretched over something he could not quite name, his hand still extended, waiting, expecting compliance to restore the balance he believed he had. But Ava did not rush, did not fill the silence he had created. She simply looked at him, steady, composed, the kind of calm that did not ask permission to exist. And somewhere behind the line of onlookers, the man in the gray suit shifted his stance, his voice again low into the earpiece. That is her, he said this time, without hesitation, and across the street, a black vehicle that had been idling unnoticed began to move, slow at first, then deliberate, its presence subtle but purposeful, blending into the rhythm of the city while carrying something entirely different beneath the surface. Back in the center of the moment, Ava finally opened the small wallet in her hand, but instead of immediately presenting anything, she paused. Just long enough for the anticipation to build, just long enough for the watching crowd to lean in without realizing it, because people always lean toward truth, even when they do not know it yet. Hayes watched closely, his eyes narrowing, expecting to confirm what he had already decided, expecting something ordinary, something that would justify the stop, justify the tone, justify the control. But what he did not expect was the absence of urgency in her movements, the absence of fear in her posture, the absence of anything that matched the narrative he had already built in his mind. And that absence began to create something dangerous for him, doubt, small at first, barely noticeable, but present, like a crack forming beneath a surface that once felt solid. Go ahead, he said, his voice firmer now, trying to reclaim the moment, trying to anchor himself back into authority. But even as he spoke, the distant hum of a radio frequency began to bleed into the edges of his awareness, faint, irregular, like a signal trying to break through noise. He ignored it at first, because routine had taught him to filter out what did not matter, but the sound persisted, subtle but insistent. And as Ava lifted her gaze once more, meeting his eyes with the same Unwavering calm, she spoke again, softer this time, but somehow clearer than anything else around them. You still have time to step back. It was not a threat, not even a warning, it was something else entirely, something closer to truth being offered freely, and that made it more unsettling than anything loud or aggressive ever could. Hayes felt it then, not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable sense that the moment was no longer unfolding the way he expected, that something beyond his control had already begun to move into place, and as the black vehicle came to a quiet stop at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed by most, the space between certainty and reality grew thinner, and for the first time, the officer who believed he was in control found himself standing in a moment that did not belong to him anymore. The silence stretched just a fraction longer than it should have, and in that fraction something invisible tipped, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Officer Hayes blinked once, then again, as if trying to clear something from his focus, his hand still extended but no longer as steady as before, the authority in his stance now held together more by habit than certainty. I am not stepping back, he said, but the words landed differently this time, thinner, less anchored, like they were echoing from a place that no longer fully believed them. Ava did not respond right away, she simply closed the wallet in her hand with a soft click, a small sound that somehow carried further than the raised voices earlier, and as she lowered it to her side, her posture remained unchanged, calm, grounded, unshaken. The kind of presence that does not react because it does not need to. Around them the crowd shifted again, subtle movements, people adjusting their stance, their phones, their attention, because even without understanding it, they could feel the shift, they could sense that this moment was no longer ordinary, that something larger was beginning to surface beneath the surface of what they were watching. Across the street, the black vehicle came to a complete stop, its engine barely audible. Its doors still closed, but the intention behind it unmistakable to those trained to notice such things. The man in the gray suit stepped forward now, just one step, not enough to interrupt, but enough to be closer, his eyes sharp, focused, his hand no longer hovering near his earpiece but resting at his side as if the confirmation he needed had already been given. And back at the center, a faint crackle finally broke through the noise, not from the crowd, not from the street, but from Hayes's own radio, clipped to his shoulder, a sound he had ignored before, a sound he could not ignore now. It came in uneven at first, static layered over urgency, a voice trying to cut through interference. Unit 7, respond. The words were faint, distorted, but they carried weight. Hayes turned his head slightly, irritation flashing across his face as he reached for the device, pressing it closer. Go ahead, he responded, his tone clipped, controlled, but the response that followed did not match his expectation. Stand by for priority verification, the voice said, clearer now, sharper, and something in the phrasing, something in the tone, made the space around him tighten again, because this was not routine, this was not the usual dispatch chatter that filled his days, this was different, and before he could respond, before he could assert control back into the moment, Ava spoke again, not louder, not stronger, just certain. It is already happening, she said, her eyes steady on his, and for the first time, Hayes did not immediately answer, did not immediately react, because the radio crackled again, louder now, the static clearing just enough for the words to land with unmistakable clarity. All units stand down, repeat, stand down. The command hung in the air, cutting through everything else, and the effect was immediate, not in action, but in awareness, because the crowd felt it, even if they did not understand it. The man in the gray suit straightened slightly, his posture shifting from observation to readiness, and Hayes, still holding the radio near his shoulder, felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, not panic, not yet, but the unmistakable realization that the situation was no longer following the path he had set, that something beyond his reach had entered the moment, and as he slowly lowered the radio, his eyes returning to Ava, the question he had not yet asked finally formed in the silence between them: who exactly was standing in front of him? The command to stand down still echoed in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough to bend the moment around it, and for the first time since this began, Officer Hayes did not speak, his mouth slightly open as if a response had been ready but no longer fit the situation, his hands slowly lowering from the radio, fingers tightening briefly as he tried to anchor himself back into something familiar, something controlled. But nothing about this felt routine anymore. The crowd had gone. Quieter now, not out of respect, but out of instinct, because people can feel when a line has been crossed even if they do not yet understand how far. Ava remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, not triumphant, not defensive, just certain, the kind of certainty that does not need to prove itself because it already exists, and that was what unsettled him the most, not her words. Not the radio, but the absence of reaction, the absence of fear, the absence of anything he had learned to expect in moments like this. "Who are you?" he finally asked, the question coming out lower than intended, less like a demand and more like something pulled from a place he did not usually access. Ava held his gaze for a brief second longer, then shifted her eyes slightly past him, not dismissing him, but no longer centered on him either, as if the focus of the moment had already moved on, and that was when the car doors opened, not abruptly, not aggressively, just in quiet synchronization, two individuals stepping out in dark suits, their movements controlled, precise, the kind that did not need to announce authority because it carried it naturally. The man in the gray suit nodded once, subtle but clear, and they approached with purpose, not toward the crowd, not toward the scene, but directly toward Ava, and as they drew closer, something else shifted. Not just in Hayes, but in everyone watching, because recognition does not always come from knowing, sometimes it comes from the way others respond, from the way space is given without being asked, from the way attention realigns without instruction. Hayes took a small step back without realizing it. His shoulders no longer squared the same way, his stance no longer rooted in the same certainty. One of the men stopped just a few feet from Ava, his voice calm, respectful. "Ma'am," he said, and that single word landed harder than anything that had been said so far, not because of volume, but because of what it implied, because of what it confirmed without explanation. Ava gave a slight nod, nothing more, no dramatic reveal, no raised voice, just acknowledgement. And in that moment, the pieces that had not made sense began to align, not fully, not yet, but enough for the truth to start taking shape. Hayes looked from the man to Ava, then back again. The question in his mind no longer abstract, no longer distant, but immediate, real, pressing, and as the radio on his shoulder crackled one final time, the voice now unmistakably clear. "Confirm identity, General Ava Carter on site." The words settled into the moment with a weight that changed everything, not in a burst, not in a spectacle, but in a quiet, undeniable shift of reality. And Hayes felt it, not as a sound, but as a realization, slow and heavy, that the moment he thought he controlled had never belonged to him at all. The word general did not explode into the moment, it settled into it, quiet but absolute, like a weight that could not be ignored once felt. And for a second that stretched longer than it should have, no one moved, not the crowd, not the men in suits, not even the traffic that seemed to slow without understanding why, and at the center of it all stood Ava Carter, unchanged, unaffected. As if nothing about this revelation altered who she had been in the moments before, because it did not, it only revealed what had always been there. Officer Hayes felt the shift more than he heard it, something internal, something structural. Like the ground beneath his certainty had quietly given way, his shoulders lowered just slightly, his stance no longer anchored in command but in uncertainty. "General," he repeated under his breath, the word unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, because moments like this did not exist in his routine, they did not fit into the patterns he had learned to rely on, and yet here it was, undeniable, unfolding in front of him. One of the suited men stepped forward just enough to close the space. His voice still calm, still controlled, but carrying an authority that did not need to raise itself. "Officer, you are going to step back," he said, not as a suggestion, not as a negotiation, but as a simple realignment of order. Hayes did not respond immediately, not out of defiance, but because his mind was catching up to a reality that had already moved past him. His eyes flicked to Ava again, searching, trying to reconcile the woman he had seen moments ago with the title now placed before her. But Ava did not fill that gap for him. She did not explain, did not justify, she simply existed in it, steady, composed, the the same as before, and that consistency made the realization heavier, not lighter, because it meant nothing had changed except his understanding. Around them, the crowd shifted again, but this time it was different, no longer curiosity, no longer passive observation, but something closer to recognition. Phones lowered slightly, voices softened, the energy no longer leaning toward spectacle but toward awareness, because even without knowing the details, they could feel that the story they thought they were watching had just rewritten itself. Hayes took a step back, small, almost unnoticeable, but enough. Enough to signal that the control he believed he had was no longer his to hold. His hand dropped fully from the radio now, resting at his side, no longer a tool of command but a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. "I did not know," he said, the words coming out slower, heavier, not as an excuse, but as an admission, and Ava finally looked at him again, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more unsettling, clarity. "You did not ask," she replied, her voice even, unraised, but carrying a weight that landed deeper than any accusation, because it was not about who she was, it was about what he assumed before knowing, and that truth settled into the space between them, undeniable, unarguable. The suited man gave a slight nod, signaling something unspoken, and in that moment the structure of authority quietly rearranged itself, not through force, not through confrontation, but through recognition, through truth, through the simple exposure of what had always been beneath the surface. And as Hayes stood there, no longer the center of the moment, no longer the one in control, he understood something he had not considered before, that power was not always loud, and that sometimes the quietest presence carried the greatest authority. The street did not return to normal, not immediately, because moments like this leave something behind, something that lingers in the air long after the words have been spoken, and as the realization settled across the faces in the crowd, the energy shifted again, quieter now, more aware, less certain of the assumptions that had filled the space just minutes before. Ava Carter stood exactly as she had from the beginning. Shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, not claiming the moment, not reacting to it, simply allowing it to unfold, because for her, nothing here was unexpected, nothing here was new. The suited men positioned themselves with subtle precision, not surrounding her, not shielding her, but aligning with her presence in a way that made it clear where authority now rested. And Officer Hayes, who had once stood at the center of control, found himself on the edge of something he could no longer define, his posture no longer rigid, his voice no longer immediate. He glanced briefly at the crowd, at the phone still held up, at the eyes that no longer looked at Ava with suspicion but now looked at him with something else, something closer to evaluation. And that shift was harder to face than anything else, because it meant the narrative had turned, not just for him, but for everyone watching. "I was following procedure," he said, the words coming slower now, not defensive, but searching, as if he were trying to place himself back into a structure that had already moved on. One of the suited men looked at him briefly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just direct. "Procedure requires clarity," he said, his tone even, not assumption. And that distinction hung in the air, simple, undeniable, leaving no space for argument. Ava took a small step forward then, not toward Hayes, not toward the crowd, but simply forward, as if continuing a path that had only been briefly interrupted, and the movement itself carried more meaning than any declaration could have, because it showed that the moment, for her, was already resolved, already complete. She paused just long enough to look at Hayes one last time, not to challenge him, not to correct him, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was, a reflection, a choice, a consequence. "What you see first is not always what is true," she said quietly, her voice steady, carrying just enough for him to hear, and just enough for those closest to feel, and with that she turned, the suited men falling into step beside her. Without instruction, their movements seamless, practiced, the kind that comes from understanding rather than command, the black vehicle door opened again, waiting, not urgently, but with certainty, and as Ava approached, the crowd instinctively made space, not out of fear, not out of pressure, but out of recognition, because something about the moment had reset the way they saw it, not just her, but everything around it. Hayes remained where he was, unmoving now, watching as the moment moved past him, not because he was forced to stay, but because he no longer knew how to step back into it, and as the door closed and the vehicle prepared to leave, the sound of the city slowly returned, conversations picking up, footsteps resuming, life continuing as it always does. But for those who had witnessed it, something had changed, something small but lasting, and as Hayes finally lowered his gaze, the weight of what had happened did not come from the title he had just heard, but from the realization that it should not have taken a title for the truth to be seen. The black vehicle pulled away from the curb with quiet precision, merging into the flow of traffic as if it had never stopped at all, and yet the space it left behind felt heavier than before, like something invisible had been removed and everything around it was still adjusting to the absence. The crowd slowly began to disperse, not all at once, but in hesitant steps, people lowering their phones, exchanging brief glances. Some shaking their heads softly, others simply walking away in silence. Because moments like that do not end with noise, they end with reflection, and Officer Hayes remained where he stood, the center of the scene now empty except for him, his hand resting loosely at his side, his radio quiet, his posture no longer defined by command but by something far more unfamiliar, stillness. He looked down at the pavement for a moment, the same ground that had felt so solid beneath him just minutes ago, now carrying a different weight, not physical, but internal, the kind that settles slowly and does not leave easily. A voice from the edge of the sidewalk broke through his thoughts. "You okay, officer?" It was one of the bystanders, a man who had stayed just a little longer than the others, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to concern. Hayes lifted his head slightly, meeting the man's eyes for a brief second before nodding once, a small, automatic gesture, but it lacked the certainty it once held. "Yeah," he said, though the word felt incomplete, like it belonged to a different moment, a different version of himself. The man hesitated as if wanting to say more, then thought better of it, and walked away, leaving Hayes alone again with the echo of what had just happened. The street returned to its rhythm, cars passing, footsteps continuing, conversations picking up as if nothing had changed. But for Hayes, everything had shifted in a way he could not ignore. He replayed the moment in his mind, not the reveal, not the title, but the beginning, the first assumption, the first words, the first decision made without question, and it was there, in that beginning, that the weight truly settled, because he realized something he had never stopped to consider before, that the outcome had not been defined by who she was, but by what he chose to see before he knew. A soft crackle came from his radio again, routine now, dispatch returning to normal. "Unit 7, status check," the voice said, casual, unaware of the shift that had taken place. Hayes paused before responding, his hand lifting slowly, pressing the button with a steadiness that did not come from confidence, but from intention. "Unit 7," he began, his voice quieter now, more measured. "I am clear." He released the button, the words simple, but the meaning behind them far from it, because clear no longer meant what it used to. It no longer meant resolved or controlled, it meant something else now. Something closer to awareness. He glanced once more down the street in the direction the vehicle had gone, though it was long out of sight, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to stand in that space without trying to fill it, without trying to justify it, just to understand it. And as he finally turned to walk back toward his patrol car, the badge on his chest felt the same as before, but the way he carried it had already begun to change. The patrol car door closed with a softer sound than usual, as if even that small action carried more weight now, and Officer Hayes sat there for a moment, without starting the engine, his hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead but not truly seeing the street in front of him, because his mind was somewhere else, looping back through the sequence of events with a clarity he had never applied before, not to others, but to himself. He remembered the first glance he had taken, the instant judgment, the way his tone had formed before any facts had. And it no longer felt routine, it felt deliberate, whether he had intended it or not, and that realization did not come with noise or panic, it came quietly, settling into his chest like a truth he could not ignore. Outside, the city continued as always, a bus passing, a group of teenagers laughing as they crossed the street, a vendor adjusting a stand on the corner, life moving forward without pause, but inside the car, time felt slower, heavier. The radio buzzed again, this time with routine chatter. Background noise he had heard 1,000 times before, but now it sounded different, not because the words had changed, but because he had. Unit 7, report back to precinct for follow-up. The dispatcher's voice came through, neutral, procedural. Unaware of the shift that had taken place, Hayes reached for the radio, hesitating just briefly before pressing the button. "Copy that," he replied, his voice steady, but there was something new in it, something more measured, less automatic, as if each word now passed through a filter it had never encountered before. He started the engine, the familiar vibration grounding him just enough to move, and as he pulled into traffic, he caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror, not just his reflection, but the uniform, the badge, the symbol he had worn every day without question, and for the first time, he did not see it as something that defined authority, but something that required responsibility. Something that demanded awareness beyond assumption. The drive back to the precinct was not long, just a few miles, but it felt different, each stoplight, each turn, each passing face carrying a new layer of awareness he had not allowed himself to feel before. He noticed things he had overlooked, the way people reacted when a patrol car passed, the subtle shifts in posture, the guarded expressions, things that had once blended into the background now standing out with quiet clarity. And by the time he pulled into the station parking lot, the weight of the moment had not faded, it had settled deeper, more defined. He stepped out of the car, the sound of the door closing echoing slightly in the enclosed space, and as he walked inside, the familiar environment of the precinct greeted him, officers moving about, paperwork being processed, conversations overlapping in a rhythm he knew well. But even here, something felt different, not in the space itself, but in the way he occupied it. A fellow officer glanced up, giving a casual nod. "Everything good out there?" he asked, the kind of question that usually required nothing more than a simple answer. Hayes paused for just a fraction longer than expected, then nodded back. "Yeah," he said, but this time, the word was not empty, it was intentional. Because good no longer meant the same thing, it no longer meant uneventful or controlled, it meant aware, it meant accountable. And as he moved further into the station, the echo of one quiet truth followed him, not loud, not demanding, but impossible to ignore, that what defines a moment is not just what happens, but how it is seen before it even begins. The precinct lights hummed softly overhead, casting that familiar pale glow across rows of desks, monitors, and half-finished reports. But for Officer Hayes, the space no longer felt as automatic as it once had. Each sound, each movement, each passing conversation now carried a clarity that he had not noticed before. He moved toward his desk, setting down his keys with a quiet clink that seemed louder than it should have been. And as he pulled out his chair, he paused, just for a second, his hand resting on the back of it as if grounding himself in something real, something steady. Across the room, voices overlapped in routine exchanges, officers discussing calls, paperwork, weekend plans, the usual rhythm of a place that never stopped moving, but none of it quite reached him the same way, because his attention was still anchored to that moment on the street, not the outcome, not the title, but the beginning, the part where everything had already been decided without being understood. He sat down slowly, the chair rolling slightly beneath him, and turned on the monitor in front of him, the screen flickering to life with reports waiting to be completed, forms that demanded clarity, documentation that required accuracy, and for the first time, he did not see them as routine tasks, he saw them as records of choices. Reflections of perception turned into action, and that changed the way his hands hovered over the keyboard, not hesitant, but intentional. He opened a new report, the cursor blinking steadily on an empty line, waiting, and for a moment, he did not type, not because he did not know what to write, but because he understood that what he wrote now mattered differently than it had before, that words were not just a summary. They were a statement of how a moment was seen, how it was interpreted, how it would be remembered. A fellow officer passed by, glancing at the screen briefly. "Long day?" he asked casually. Hayes looked up, meeting his eyes for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Different day," he replied, the words simple, but carrying more weight than they appeared to. The officer shrugged lightly and moved on, the conversation ending as quickly as it began. But for Hayes, the distinction remained. Different meant something had shifted, something had been seen in a way it had not been before. He turned back to the screen, the cursor still blinking, steady, patient, and this time, he began to type, not rushing, not filling space, but choosing each word with a clarity that came from awareness rather than assumption. Outside the precinct windows, the sun had begun to lower, casting longer shadows across the parking lot, the day moving forward as it always did, but inside, something had settled into place. Not as a resolution, not as an answer, but as a recognition that every moment carried a choice, not just in action, but in perception, and as Hayes continued typing, the noise of the precinct faded slightly into the background, replaced by a quieter understanding, one that did not demand attention, but remain present all the same, that authority is not defined by control, but by how carefully it chooses to see before it decides to act. The cursor continued to blink, steady and patient, as Officer Hayes read over the words he had written, not scanning them for errors, but for truth, because for the first time, accuracy was not just about facts, it was about perspective, about whether the report reflected what had actually happened or what he had assumed in the moment, and that difference, small on the surface, carried a weight he could not ignore. He leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the quiet hum of the station, and as he looked at the screen again, he noticed something subtle, the absence of certainty in his earlier language, the way phrases had once been filled in automatically, shaped by habit rather than reflection, and now, those same spaces demanded something more, something honest. A voice from across the room called out, "Hayes, you good on that report?" It was Sergeant Miller, standing near the front desk, clipboard in hand, his tone casual but expectant. Hayes turned slightly in his chair, nodding once. "Almost done," he replied, and this time, the words carried intention, not just completion. Miller gave a short nod and moved on, trusting the process as he always had. But Hayes understood now that the process itself was only as reliable as the perspective behind it. He turned back to the screen, his fingers hovering briefly before continuing, adjusting a sentence, removing a phrase that no longer felt accurate, replacing it with something clearer, something that reflected not just what he saw, but what he now understood. Outside the windows, the light had shifted further, the sky moving toward that late afternoon glow that softened the edges of everything, and inside, the rhythm of the station remained steady. But Hayes no longer moved within it the same way. He was aware now, aware of the pauses between decisions, aware of the space between observation and conclusion, aware of how easily those spaces could be filled with assumption if left unchecked. A notification popped up on his screen, routine, a request for additional documentation, something that would normally be handled without thought, but now, even that felt different, not heavier, just clearer, more deliberate. He clicked through it, responding carefully, each action aligned with the same quiet understanding that had begun to take shape earlier, and as he worked, the memory of Ava's voice returned, not loud, not repeated, just present. "You did not ask." And those words did not feel like a criticism anymore. They felt like a reminder, a standard, something simple that had been overlooked, and something that would not be ignored again. He finished the report, reading it one last time, not for perfection, but for alignment, making sure that what was written matched what was true, not just in action, but in intent, and when he finally submitted it, the act felt different, not routine, not automatic, but complete in a way he had not experienced before. He leaned back again, letting the chair settle beneath him, his eyes drifting briefly across the room, taking in the movement, the conversations, the familiar environment that had not changed, even as he had, and in that moment, he understood something quietly but clearly, that growth does not announce itself, it does not arrive with noise or recognition, it happens in the smallest shifts. In the moments where a decision is made differently than it would have been before, and as the station continued around him, unchanged and constant, Hayes sat there with a new awareness, not something visible, not something spoken, but something that would shape every moment that followed, because once you see the difference between assumption and truth, you cannot unsee it, and from that point forward, every choice carries that knowledge with it. The station had settled into its evening rhythm, that quiet transition where urgency softened but never fully disappeared, and Officer Hayes remained at his desk, not because he had more work to do, but because leaving felt premature, as if walking away too soon would mean losing something he had only just begun to understand. The overhead lights reflected faintly on his screen, now dimmed, the report submitted, the task complete, yet the moment still present, not demanding attention, but refusing to fade. Across the room, laughter broke out briefly between two officers sharing a story from earlier in the day, normal, unfiltered, the kind of sound that usually blended into the background, but tonight it stood out, not as distraction, but as contrast. A reminder that life continues regardless of what shifts beneath it. Hayes leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. His hands loosely clasped, his gaze unfocused, not fixed on anything in particular, just allowing the silence between thoughts to exist. And in that space, something settled more clearly than before, not the details of what had happened, but the meaning behind it, the pattern, the habit, the way a moment can be shaped before it even begins. He thought about how many times he had trusted instinct without questioning it. How often he had filled in gaps with assumptions that felt like experience. And how easily those assumptions could become decisions without ever being examined. The realization was not overwhelming, it was precise, quiet, and that made it harder to dismiss. A voice approached from behind, slower this time, more deliberate. Hayes. Sergeant Miller stood just a few feet away, his expression neutral but attentive. "I read your report," he said, and there was a pause, not uncomfortable, but intentional. "It is thorough." Hayes turned slightly, meeting his gaze, not searching for approval, not bracing for critique, just present. Miller nodded once. "You asked the right questions?" he added, the words simple, but carrying a recognition that went beyond paperwork. Hayes gave a small nod in return, not out of habit, but acknowledgement, because he understood now that asking the right questions was not just part of the job, it was the job. Miller lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, leaving Hayes alone again, but this time the silence felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but grounded, as if something had aligned beneath the surface. Hayes stood up slowly, the chair rolling back a few inches, and as he reached for his jacket, his hand paused briefly over the badge pinned to his chest, not adjusting it, not checking it, just acknowledging it, because it no longer felt like a symbol he simply wore, it felt like something he carried, something that required more than presence, it required awareness, intention. And as he stepped toward the exit, the hallway lights guiding his path, he noticed the way his steps felt more deliberate, not slower, not hesitant, just chosen. Outside, the evening air was cooler, the city lights beginning to take over as the sun disappeared, and for a moment, he stood there, just outside the station doors, taking in the quiet transition from day to night, a reflection of something internal, something that had shifted without announcement. And as he looked out across the street, watching people move through their own routines, unaware of the moment that had unfolded earlier, he understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. That change does not come from being told what is right. It comes from seeing what was wrong in a way you can no longer ignore, and once that line is crossed, there is no going back to the way things were seen before. The city had fully transitioned into night, the glow of streetlights stretching across the pavement in long, quiet lines, and Officer Hayes stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not waiting for anything, not expecting anything, just allowing the stillness to settle around him, because for the first time in a long time, he was not rushing to move past the moment, he was standing inside it, understanding it. The sounds of the city were softer now, less urgent, cars passing at a steady pace, distant voices blending into the background, and in that quiet, something became clear in a way it had not before, not as a lesson taught, but as a truth realized. Earlier that day, everything had seemed simple, a routine stop, a familiar pattern, a decision made without hesitation, but now, standing under the dim light, he could see the layers that had been invisible to him before. The assumptions that had filled in the blanks, the confidence that had come not from knowledge, but from habit, and the difference between those two things was not small, it was everything. He exhaled slowly, the cool air grounding him, and as he began to walk toward his car, his steps were steady, not heavy, not uncertain, just intentional, each movement chosen rather than automatic, because something had shifted, not in the world around him, but in the way he moved through it. He reached the car and paused, his hand resting briefly on the door handle. His reflection faint in the window, the badge on his chest catching just enough light to remind him of what it represented, not authority alone, but responsibility, not control, but accountability. And as he opened the door and sat inside, the familiar space felt different, not because it had changed, but because he started the engine, the soft hum filling the silence, and for a moment, he did not pull away, he simply sat there, looking out at the street ahead. At the people moving through their lives, each one carrying a story he could not see at a glance, each one deserving more than a moment of assumption, and that realization did not come with guilt, it came with clarity, the kind that does not weigh you down, but pushes you forward. The radio remained quiet, no calls, no interruptions, just a rare moment of stillness in a job that rarely allowed it, and in that stillness, one thought settled into place, simple, undeniable. That the way you see a person is the beginning of every decision you make about them, and if that beginning is wrong, everything that follows will be too. He shifted the car into drive, pulling slowly onto the street, merging into the flow of traffic, not as someone returning to routine, but as someone stepping into it with a new awareness. And as the city lights passed by, reflecting briefly across the windshield before fading into the dark, the moment from earlier no longer felt like something that had happened to him, it felt like something that had changed him. And as he continued down the road, one quiet truth remained, steady and clear, guiding every mile ahead. He thought he was the law, but that night, the law had a new meaning.